Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for a presentation from the Knoxville Area Association of Realtors, specifically Hanson Sale, on the 2023 State of Housing Report. Mr. Sale, I will turn it over to you.
Great, good to see all of you. Hanson Sale, as most of you know. So I'm going to just jump into the data and get through the presentation so we can have a conversation, because I think it's a pretty big topic. So I like to start off these presentations just with where are we right now? The economy and the housing market are both cooling, but it's important to note that Knoxville has seen a slowdown in a much less significant way than the rest of the country. So when you look at other parts of the country, we're holding pretty strong. And I like to say, do you remember that low home price advantage that we talk about when we recruit business to Knoxville? It's gone, and I'll show you why. And the pandemic provoked structural changes in the housing market, and I will get into that as well. So just I like to start these off with some just general economic trends, because housing is the business cycle. They're intimately related. So just looking at our economy as a whole, this is showing real inflation-adjusted economic growth. So you can see in 2021 and 2022, we had very strong growth, and do note that in 2022, our economy grew at nearly twice the pace of the U.S. overall. So we are growing quickly in terms of economic output, and we are anticipating that we're going to see that slow down, but stay relatively strong going back. Looking at employment, we hear a lot about, when we're talking about the labor shortage, that people aren't going back to work. It's not necessarily true. Our employment base right now, total employment, is up over 6% from pre-pandemic. So our employment base is growing pretty dramatically, and has been for the better part of a year and a half now. But the one thing that we're seeing, and this is in part because we're an aging population, we're seeing retirees come to Knoxville. Our labor force participation rate is down, but it's not something that is all that COVID related. It's more of a long-term trend that's been happening, as you can see, really since 2010. This is another important part, because I talk a lot about the labor market in terms of housing, because the labor market ultimately drives the housing market. And so you can see here, our 65 and older share of our metro population is growing really quickly, and our prime age working share, those people that we are really trying to recruit to Knoxville, are declining as a share of our population, which has some really big implications for the labor market, but also for housing. So, and another thing that is a broader economic trend that has really big impacts on the housing market is inflation. As you can see here, this is the actual index that the Fed tracks for inflation. We all see the CPI, but they don't actually follow that. They follow core PCE. What you can see is stripping out core PCE is stripping out some of the volatile energy, gas, food prices, and you can see inflation's moving sideways. And so reading into these trends, it doesn't look great for mortgage rates. The idea that the Fed's going to start cutting rates this year, I think, is a little far-fetched given what we've seen, and we really need to see a sustained decline, not just a couple of months, but a sustained decline. And because of this, we've seen the strongest pace of monetary policy tightening on record, which has provoked one of the fastest interest rate increases, mortgage rate increases, as you can see the orange line here, bottoming out at like 2.75. I have a 2.75 rate. I'm never letting go of that sucker. It's well over 6 and has hovered that around there, which is, again, big implications for housing. So getting into what is actually happening housing-wise, what happened in 2022? So home sales dropped 9% in 2022, which is the largest drop since the Great Recession. And it all happened in the third and fourth quarter of last year. We're starting to turn things around, but it was a big drop. Home prices, however, have been pretty steady. You can see on the West Coast, if you read national news, it looks like home prices are dropping, not here. We grew 16.7% in 2022, and we're already seeing some of the price growth come back. And you can see here in 2022, the Knoxville Metro was number 6 in the country for price growth, and we've outpaced the national average in every quarter since 2018. So it's not a COVID trend, it's a long-term trend. Just looking at inventory, this is showing you inventory for the MSA and Knox County. It's really low. We have seen a little bit of an uptick in inventory, but it's still half of what it was pre-pandemic and a fourth of what it was in just 2017. So again, this is not a COVID trend per se. It is a long-term trend that we're seeing happening that was definitely exacerbated by COVID. And so looking at the regional listing price, so this is just the median price of listings that are on the market, so not sold. But you can see here throughout all of our history, we've had a price premium in our housing market. It's been cheaper to move here, add on that we don't have a state income tax. It's a really affordable place to live. It's really great for remote workers, but it's great for business as well. But we've seen that change dramatically. So you see the national median listing price started to fall mid-2022. Knoxville just kept on going, and as of April, our median listing price was $50,000 higher than the national average. So hey, we're that Knoxville affordable place to live. In terms of home prices, it's just not true anymore, which is something that I think is sad to see go, but an important trend that we should be looking at. We hear a lot of conversation about investors' impact in the market. You can see here, this is our analysis just for Knox County that shows about 14% of home sales in the county were investor purchases. I will say this is probably the higher end of the spectrum because we can't really tell the difference between an iBuyer who actually puts the home back on the market, so they're not taking away and renting. But we've seen an increase, but it's not a substantial increase to the extent that does it have an overall market effect on our home prices? I would argue no. There is research. Freddie Mac put out some research late last year that said that they don't believe that investor purchases, particularly institutional investor purchases, had all that much of an impact on home prices. And I will say the research that NAR has done on the topic says that investors tend to offer about the same amount in terms of what their offer prices are, and oftentimes a little bit lower than typical owner occupants. So yes, they have some advantages in terms of being able to waive contingencies, things like that, cash, but do they offer substantially more for homes? Not necessarily. So looking at the rental market, again, also really, really substantial growth. So effective rents, so just average rents in the Knoxville metro area are almost $450 higher than pre-pandemic levels, which is substantial. We have seen some of the fastest rent growth in the country. We were #1 for rent growth in the country in 2022, and we're staying in the top 5 as of the first quarter of 2023. So continuing to see rent growth. Looking at occupancy, this is kind of a funky graph. Focus on the blue bars here, which is occupancy. You can see our rental apartment occupancy rate rose almost to 99%, which in effect is full, virtually completely full. So not only are we seeing more expensive rental units, but it's just increasingly hard to find one at all. And then to add on to that, finding a rental unit at all that's also affordable. These trends are really coming together to make it hard for renters. But there is good news on the rental side. Nearly 2,000 units are under construction right now and slated to become available in the next 12 months. It's really, as you can see in this graph, very substantial. That's great news for renters. Will it provoke a decline in rent prices? Probably not, but will it keep rent growth lower than what we've seen in previous years? I think so. Really good news. It is very clustered in the downtown area, but we're starting to see it spread out, particularly in some of our outlying parts of the county. So looking at what does this all mean in terms of affordability? So a couple of different indicators. So this is a housing affordability index that 100 means that the typical median household can qualify for the median priced home with a 10% down payment. By that measure, housing affordability is at its lowest level since the 1980s. So very substantial decline. We were, as you can see, really in the post-2010 through 2015, and really just until recently, we've been relatively affordable, but that drop in the post-COVID era is what has really weighed on our housing affordability. So looking at it another way, this is just showing what do you need, what annual income do you need to purchase the median-priced home in 2021 versus 2022. We make some assumptions here, 10% down payment, 3% closing costs, so on and so on. You need around $56,000 in 2021, and that rose all the way to almost $89,000 in 2022. And I don't know about you guys, I didn't get a $33,000 raise last year, and I suspect that most people didn't. And so really, really big changes in the housing market. Looking at another measure of affordability is not looking at can you afford the house that just sold, but what can you afford of the houses that are actively listed on the market. So what you can see here is if you make less than $75,000, you can afford about 15% of active inventory. So this is what I've been calling the triple threat of the housing market. It's rising interest rates, high home prices, compounded by low inventory, that all come together to mean that 2/3 of the population can afford 1/5 of the active listings on any given day, which is really substantial. 75,000 is well over our median, and well over the starting salary for a teacher, for example. And also, it's important to note that affordability overall has declined, but it's been most dramatic for the entry-level price point. This is month supply, which is a balanced, healthy market. The industry standard is 6 months of supply. As you can see, we're really not meeting that in any circumstance, and we weren't pre-pandemic, but we really aren't now, and that's particularly acute for the entry-level price point. So anybody who's out there buying and selling knows that it's really hard to find a house under $300,000 in Knox County these days. So what are the challenges? Underbuilding, rising costs. This is our estimate of the housing shortage for the metro area. So this is not just Knox County. Obviously, a huge percentage of this shortage is in Knox County. We don't do a particular estimate because of some limitations in the data, but basically what this is showing you is our estimate. So we're looking at long-term trends, and this methodology is used by Freddie Mac. It's used by Rosen Consulting Group, which is a really well established housing consulting agency that's just looking at if we want to maintain the affordability that we've had previously. So if we thought that what we've had over the pre-2010 era, that level of affordability is acceptable, and I would argue, yes, it is. We all brand ourselves as Knoxville, affordable place to be. That should be the standard. So using that standard and weighting it by how many households we have and showing how many completions, we've accrued somewhere between 22 and 25,000 housing units short of what we would need to maintain the level of affordability that we've been accustomed to in a long-term trend. And I think it's important too to just add that baseline period that we're using encompasses 2 business cycles. Boom and bust. It's a long-term average. It's something that we can benchmark ourselves to. And as you can see, we're just now getting back up to what we need to do, but to start chipping away at that housing shortage, we have to build over that orange line, and we're not even there yet. And particularly important as well is that there's been a decline in the lower price point new construction, and none of this should be interpreted as a home builder's problem. Home builders are doing everything they can. We've put a lot of obstacles in their way, and then they're facing a lot of obstacles of not having labor, all kinds of different things, and I'll show you as well. But we definitely have seen a sustained trend in that low-level price point. We're not seeing it in new construction. It's really declining in part because it's just not financially feasible. In part because this is the change in price in different building materials since the pandemic. So paint, 31%, softwood lumber, 28%, concrete, 20%. It's virtually impossible to build homes at the price point that we all would generally say is affordable, given the density limitations that we currently have in place. It's just not feasible, in part because land prices are growing really substantially. So this is, the AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, does these estimates. Basically, it's an average value of a quarter-acre lot normalized. And so you can see $30,000, or we'll look at Knox, $29,000 in 2012, all the way up to $102,000 in 2021. So land is our most valuable commodity, and it's not a commodity because we can't get more of it. And that is contributing to housing prices in part because the average share of a home's value that is solely attributable to the land underneath it, which is we dictate how much land is underneath your house. That's 44% of home prices as of 2021, up from 24% in 2012. So really, really substantial. Another part of the long-term conversation is what we call the lock-in effect. I think this is incredibly staggering. 8 in 10 homeowners with a mortgage in the state of Tennessee have a rate below 4 or 5%. Which is 1.5 points below the prevailing rate right now. That's incredibly substantial. This is not my joke, and it's slightly inappropriate, but the NAR economist, our chief economist, said, you might hate your wife, but you love your 2% interest rate a lot more, which is not totally true, but it is a really big financial consideration. I speak from my own perspective as a young person living in Knoxville. I can't afford the house that I live in right now. My mortgage payment would be $1,000 more than what it is. And that's going to have a substantial impact on people's decision to move and whether to list their homes, and also importantly, whether they list their homes or rent it. If I'm moving, I'm going to hang on to that 2.75 rate and rent that sucker out and buy something else. And I think we're going to start seeing that more and more as people have virtually free money, if you will, in terms of a long-term mortgage rate that's well below the rate of inflation. And we're already seeing this in the data. So you can see that big dark line is the number of new listings in the Knoxville metro area. New listings are down. They hit the lowest level on record in December 2022. And as you can see in the early months of 2023, they're staying below, and in part because a substantial number of people have very low interest rates, and the prospect of trading out their interest rate for one that's double their current interest rate doesn't feel all that great. And it's important just to hammer home the point that this is not something that ends tomorrow. These are 30-year mortgages, and will we see interest rates at sub 3 in the next 10 years? It's not all that likely at this point. And so this is something that's going to be a long-term trend that I think is important to point out. So also wanted to throw in here some of the homeownership disparities that show up in the data. Something that's interesting, the white-black homeownership gap in the Knoxville metro area is 30 points. And what is interesting is that the black homeownership rate is lower than the state and national average. And that is also true of every other minority group. They're all lower than the state and national average in Knoxville, in part because we're generally a little bit more urban, and that tends to be the case because our overall homeownership rate is higher than the state and national average. So there's significant disparities, and part of that is unequal access to mortgage credit. This is not necessarily discrimination per se, but it is institutioned, not having credit. We're working on different strategies through Fannie Mae is now incorporating rent payments, which is going to be a really great thing for access to mortgages. But looking at, this is for Knox County, looking at denial rates, Black and Hispanic borrowers are denied at twice the rate of white borrowers and Asian borrowers. So it is a big disparity. The big important point, though, is how these disparities largely are born because of income disparities. And what is really important to note is how affordability challenges limit access to high opportunity areas. So I think you guys can all relate that some of the places where people most want to live when a new housing development is proposed there is where it's most vigorously opposed. You see it in rezoning after rezoning. That tends to be the case, but it has the effect of locking different people out of those areas, the areas that are the highest opportunity areas. There's really great research by a Harvard economist named Raj Chetty that basically shows that we can look at the zip code that you grew up in and basically determine your lifetime earnings with reasonable accuracy. So it's not necessarily a racial thing so much as access to high opportunity areas, social networks, social capital, and things of that nature. And so what you see is that Black borrowers are nearly twice as likely to purchase in a low-income area, and a whopping 28% of mortgage applications from Black applicants are in low-income areas, whereas when you see in the white applicants, it's much more balanced. You also see this show up in the Hispanic population. The Asian population is sort of an outlier here, where almost a quarter of their applications are in high-income areas. So it's not strictly a racial issue. It's more of an issue of access to different opportunity areas and where we build housing and where affordable housing is located. So we think, and based on our report, we believe that housing demand over the next decade is going to be strong, and here's a couple of points why. So this is showing the distribution of our metro population by generation. And so what you can see is that big spike in millennials, and it's generally higher. Millennials are aging into their prime home buying years. So younger millennials are buying for the first time, older millennials maybe moving up, having kids, and now they're looking for an extra bedroom, those sorts of things. And then you also see that the other largest living generation is the baby boomers, who are getting close to retirement age, if not already in retirement, who are also actively in the market trying to find a different type of home that might be more accessible. And particularly after COVID, the prospect of being in an assisted living facility is just a little bit less desirable after what played out over the course of the pandemic. We're starting to see this trend of baby boomers downsizing. And there's not a lot of options. And what I like to point out is these two big home buying populations. We predominantly in East Tennessee build 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom houses. I would argue that young millennials can't afford and don't want a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom house, and that might also be the case for baby boomers who can't afford and don't want a big house with a yard. And so it's also an issue of providing different types of housing, but these demographic trends definitely show that we're going to continue to see people in the market buying, and this isn't even factoring in some of the other trends like declining household size. Even if we stopped growing in terms of population today, our households are getting smaller and a large number of people are living on their own. Baby boomers are actually the fastest growing percentage of sole person households. So people are living on their own more often, which does a single person need a big house? Is a big house affordable to them? But even if we stopped growing and population, with a declining household size, we're still going to need more housing units in terms of quantity. We can start having a conversation about how many empty bedrooms exist in Knox County, which is a very interesting point, but it doesn't necessarily get at what is the number of units we need. And declining share of sole, or a higher share of sole person households has a really big impact on that. And also migration. Obviously, we've all heard that there are a lot of people moving here. You hear California in the news quite a bit. It is corroborated in the data, but it's not. Californians don't represent the majority of people moving here. The majority of people buying in our region are still local. It's not a majority of out of state. But we are seeing and attracting people from California, from Chicago, New York, DC, all kinds of places, and interestingly completely reversed our Nashville trend. Some emerging data that I think is fairly reliable is showing that the #1 destination for renters leaving Nashville is Knoxville, and that's a lot of people. And we're also seeing in terms of home ownership that we're seeing more people come from Nashville to Knoxville than are leaving Knoxville to go to Nashville. So we're starting to reverse some historic trends. But it's also important to know that regional population growth is almost exclusively being driven by migration. More people have died than were born in the past 2 years in our metro area. And so all of the population growth that we've seen is virtually by migration. So what's next? The 2023 outlook, our forecast for the market. For 2023, you can see the final numbers for 21, 22. We're used the average mortgage rate at 6.4%. That's Freddie Mac's estimate, but our estimate is that we're going to see home prices grow by 3 to 5% next year. I'm very proud of myself because our NAR chief economist put out a forecast specific to a couple of the top metros in the country for 2023, and one of them was Knoxville, and he came up with the exact same number that I did 2 weeks before. So I'm hoping that it's a reliable estimate, but as we know, forecasting is not the easiest thing to do in the world. We do think home sales are going to continue to decline before rebounding in 2024, but we're in it for the long haul in terms of there's no inventory, which is going to weigh on home sales, but then affordability in general is also going to weigh on home sales. So definitely going to see a decline there. On the rental side, with as many rental units slated to become available, we do think that the occupancy rate is going to fall. 96.6 is still pretty high. 93 to 94 is what's considered healthy for a rental market. And in part, this is going to continue to decline over a number of years. The 2,000 units probably aren't going to hit the market next year, in part because developers are still having a hard time getting dishwashers or doors or windows. There's a lot of delays going on, but we do think that rent growth, given the underlying demographic trends, given what we're seeing in occupancy rates, we'll see positive rent growth of around 4% in 2023, although that could vary depending on how quickly supply chain issues wane out. So that's our forecast. And to end on a last slide before we get to questions, and I know there's a number of people here to help answer, one thing, the takeaway that we and I come away from this report is that failing to invest in our housing supply today is ultimately going to be at the expense of our economic growth and prosperity tomorrow. Housing is the business cycle. If we want to continue to grow, and if we want to support essential workers, the people who during the pandemic we acutely felt, police officers, first responders, paramedics, pharmacy techs, school teachers, the people who keep our society and our economy going, if we want to continue to support them, then we have to put our money where our mouth is, because we can raise salaries all day and housing costs are going to continue to rise. It's ultimately a supply problem. And so that is the big takeaway that I wanted to leave you with before we get to questions. And I was on time. If you obviously can, you guys don't need this information, but I throw it in there. Thank you for being willing and being here today to engage on these issues. I think it's important to have a bunch of different voices, because ultimately we all have to live with the decisions we make, but we are in amid the process at Vance Knox that is likely the most important thing we will do in the next decade, and decisions that you make today will have an indelible impact on people of all ages and the future of Knoxville, and I think it's important to acknowledge that. So thank you, and excited to have a good discussion.
Thank you, Hanson. Commissioner Jay, your light's on.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for another great housing report and lots of data to digest. Some new stuff as well. It's really interesting to me. Back on, it's slide 12, you talked about the housing inventory. Do you have any data on that's just-in-time inventory, but how often things turn over? I mean, single-family homes, condos, suburbs, urban, rent. I mean, some of that available inventory it could potentially free up if it gets out of the freeze zone, or your frozen sort of section. But do you have a sense of what turns over when and how? And ultimately, what I'm getting to is that are there policies that, for instance, you talked about the one person in the house. My neighbor is one person in a house. She's in the baby boomer or even older generation. There are no condos. She would love to downsize with no maintenance. There's nowhere to go. So do you have a sense of the turnover rates and what policies might accelerate those to open up more inventory?
That's a really good question. We don't have great data on turnover, so we do have like a high-level statistic that is just the average number of years that people stay in their house. And Knoxville is actually one of the lowest in the country in terms of the average number of years people stay in their house is actually really low in Knoxville. I think it's sort of a deceiving statistic because we've had so many, we're a high migration hotspot where, people who are moving in are artificially bringing that number down. In terms of turnover, it's just hard to say. We don't have great data on it. I wish we did. It's a really interesting question, but there's not a lot of great data on that point in particular.
What do you know about renters? I mean, that has grown exponentially. Of course, the amount of rent has too, the occupancy rates. We're sort of becoming a renter place more and more, but what motivates them? What do we know about how that changes population? I mean, in today's Compass, there was a significant article about just the amount of population growth that has happened so quickly that I think all of us were kind of caught up, not off guard, but we're like continuously impressed with. So what does that tell you about the rental market?
The rental market's changing. There's actually some really good survey data on Knoxville renters, in particular, just looking at average income, and we've seen over the past 5 years that more high-income households are choosing to rent. So historically speaking, the average renter income has been fairly low, so it's been, in Knoxville in particular, has been lower income residents, but it's growing, so more high income households are choosing to rent. And so it's people who are just merely choosing to rent, whether they own investment properties, I don't know, but they're choosing to rent. We're also seeing that average age grow, so people later in life are choosing to rent. So the big shift in our rental market in particular is that, higher income households are choosing to rent, and alternatively, we're also seeing migration from areas where it's more common to rent, and the hassles and some people think that owning a home is a hassle, particularly if you're from a big city. And as we attract more people from big cities, we're just naturally going to see our rental rate rise, generally speaking. But we do have a really shifting rental market. And lastly, we're also seeing typically the student housing market is really different from the rest of the rental market to the extent that you rent out bedrooms in the student market as opposed to entire units. We're seeing a lot more students seep into the private rental market, particularly downtown. Obviously, that is related to students not being able to find housing. Will that continue to be the case as we see more student housing? It's conceivably yes, but we're definitely seeing a shift in terms of students seeping into what would be traditionally considered the private rental market.
I have a couple other questions, but I'll yield for a while and come back. Thanks.
Thank you. Commissioner Frazier?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Hanson, for a great report. Just some questions, and you and I, we talk frequently about this because we're both kind of data nerds and we like this kind of stuff. But first, for the public who maybe is watching and our constituents, tell us a little bit about your position and your role, and then also like where the funding for your position comes from.
The funding for my position comes the Knoxville Area Association of Realtors. We're a nonpartisan trade association and represent just over 6,000 realtors across 12 counties in East Tennessee. So I'm employed by the realtors, and part of my job is advocacy to support home ownership, to support housing, the real estate industry. these reports, we take great care in making sure that they're as objective as possible. And yeah, so, that's summary.
That's exactly what I want. I mean, a lot of people are like, Hanson Sale, okay, what does he do? Who does he work for? I get those questions a lot. So I just thought, you know what, this is a good opportunity for you to just kind of explain that a little bit. And then, we've talked about, we kind of have this conversation on loop about underbuilding. And so one question you and I have talked about, I've talked with Director Brooks and the county too, is that, realistically, what are the numbers? How many units do we have that have been approved and are in the pipeline, but yet not constructed? Because I think that's an important piece of information for us also to consider in the conversation of we tend to be underbuilding. And I know that they did a great development activity report for 2022, and it kind of shows that, residential building permits for 2022, about 4,100. We had right at 690 rezonings. We have approximately 1,300 new lots. And then going into, that's about 689 acres that was rezoned to residential. And then total units, about 4,371. Director Brooks, is that about right? Are those units that have been approved and have yet to be constructed? Do you have that answer, Hanson, or?
I will defer to Amy on the specifics.
It's the Development Activity Report for 2022. It's got a lot of great information.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner Fraser. I would recommend that you all take a look at that development activity report. The data is current as of December 2022. So this is all included in that report. So residential building permits that had been approved for Knox County were 2,481. 2022 subdivisions, there were 1,216 approved lots. I don't have the data related to the rezonings at my fingertips right now, but it's in the report.
Yeah, it's just great information, and thank you. I just wanted to point that out too. And Hanson, I've had this conversation. People tell us we don't want Knox County to become Nashville. And there's a lot of factors in that conversation. Do you think we're doing anything to prevent that, or do you have any recommendations to prevent that as far as, really preserving the landscape of what makes Knox County really beautiful and attractive to people moving into the area?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I would argue that we are absolutely doing something about that in the form of advanced Knox. It's something that's been deferred for far too long, and the planning process is really important. I think the thing that we could do to not, if we want to, Nashville is busy and unaffordable, and, we also hear, we don't want to become California. Well, in the 1980s, California used to be zoned all multifamily. They cut their density by 80%, and now, 40 years later, they're starting to get rid of single-family zoning because they recognize that they swung too far. And so it's finding a balance, obviously, and I think advanced Knox is the avenue by which we do that. I think that is quite honestly, I don't think the Nashville comparison is a great example, and only because we aren't Nashville. We're never going to be Nashville, but we do have to grapple with the fact of, if we continue to build as at current levels, we're not going to be the really affordable East Tennessee city that we've always been, and change is inevitable. So how do we do it in a good way? And I would argue that advanced Knox is really critical to that, and why I truly believe it will be Mayor Jacobs' legacy, and the most important thing that this commission does and this county does in the next decade, quite frankly.
You talked about the uptick in apartment homes. Do you see a direct correlation with that impacting home ownership of residents here that have been here for a while, and it's kind of cutting them out, or?
You see more of a shift of people holding on to single-family homes and renting them and then moving to apartments. It's not really crowding people out of the home ownership market per se. there's huge demand for single-family rentals, which is sort of an acknowledged thing, is that if people didn't want to rent single-family homes, then we wouldn't see this trend of more rentals in the single-family home market. It's something that's desirable for a lot of people, but I don't think it's necessarily a direct correlation so much as, our homeownership rate has actually been fairly flat, all things considered. I mean, it's going to vary just based off of population weighting and things like that from the Census Bureau, but I would argue it's been pretty flat, and I'm not sure that the increase in apartment units are directly having much of an impact on people's decision to rent or own, given the trade-offs.
So we know UT is growing. They just announced, another growth idea. What kind of impact is that having on housing in the county and the city? They continue to grow. Those students have nowhere to go. We're seeing students then and families of students purchasing homes, really kind of outbidding local residents from homes. Is there any correlation? Are they a part of the projections? Are they a part of the conversation about the housing shortage that we seem to have and the part that they play in that?
I can't stand up here and honestly say that they're not having an impact on the competition in our market. They absolutely are, but I think it's hard to isolate that. I mean, it's also provoked a huge increase in housing supply in terms of development, but it's hard to say. I mean, I live in a neighborhood where half of my neighborhood is employed by the University of Tennessee, and so the impact of students on housing costs, it has to have an impact. The sheer quantity has an impact, but how do you weigh that against, UT employees who, frequent local businesses and the substantial portion of our economy that you can attribute to the university? I mean, they're definitely having an impact. Is it a conversation we need to have? Absolutely. Do I have the perfect answer? Probably not, because this is an issue that I think we have to have more government, private, and university involvement on. We have not engaged this conversation in a meaningful way, in my opinion, but it's certainly having an impact. It's just how do you weigh the costs and benefits of that?
And then what does the future of mortgage lending look like?
Very good question. That's a big question that I think if I had a great answer to, I would be paid a lot more and probably not live in Knoxville. But I think we're going to continue to see. I mean, the 30-year mortgage is unique in globally speaking. Most countries in this in the world don't have 30-year fixed rate mortgages. They don't have easy access to long-term lending to purchase a home. So, I'm not sure that things are going to change that much. You're starting to see rate buy downs and things like that. I think that's going to continue to happen. But what's really fundamentally important is that the Dodd-Frank and regulations coming out of 2008 have fundamentally changed our lending process to the people who are getting loans are overqualified and have higher credit scores. They have to prove what they have in their bank accounts. The future of lending is much more stable than it was 15 years ago, and it's in part why, if we were in a housing collapse, we would see people listing their houses for sale and at a price premium, but homeowners aren't accepting lower home prices right now. So I think it's important to note that if we were in sort of a shift, I think we would see more houses on the market at a lower price, but we're not. So don't have a totally amazing answer for that.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you. Commissioner Hill?
Thank you, Hanson. You're very thorough in your report. I appreciate that. One of your charts says that the median sale price in a house last year was $315,000. So is that the magic number for an affordable house? How do you What is an affordable house?
Well, I think that's a great question. And so it's looking at, I think affordability is sort of a shifting target because it's not one factor. I mean, 350, I mean, it's all about what kind of jobs we have. If we have higher income jobs and we're seeing incomes grow, then, you know, a higher price point might be more affordable. But what I would say is that when we start looking at and it also shifts based off of mortgage rates, which are cyclical and no one can really predict. So
Today, what is an affordable house?
It's a very good question. I would argue that at our current interest mortgage rates, it's probably sub 300.
Sub 3. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Hill. Commissioner Lundy?
Thank you. You said something about the minority population, like how can we increase the access and opportunity to become homeowners? Have you done
Yeah, a
anything
lot.
in your research?
Go ahead. Yeah, well, I think it's a really important question. Part of it is engaging, there's a lot of programs now. It's really, I hate the answer of education because I think that's what we always do, but it really is an important and very critical part of this because a lot of it is misnomers about what it requires to purchase a home. I spoke with Commissioner Jay not long ago. He was like staggered at me showing what a 5% down payment like affordability is, and that's standard today. 5 and 3% isn't really uncommon, and so breaking down the barriers of thinking that you need 20% down to purchase a home is really important, and also utilizing some of these features that we have in mortgage lending that aren't necessarily standard, but rent reporting, for example. You can report your rent payments, and that can build credit history. You don't have to have a credit card. You can just show that you've paid your rent for a certain period of time. So there's a lot of these programs that I think we as a community could really embrace in terms of, even in our public housing. I'm not, I would love to know this. I don't have an answer for it, but I would love to hear from KCDC with our subsidized housing. Are we reporting that our, tenants, when they have positive rent history, are we reporting that to credit agencies to help build credit? There's a litany of different things we can do. It just sort of takes a focused effort on it, and it's a really big issue.
Yeah. Are there any organizations that hold the education, the tools to get that access that you know of?
I'm inevitably going to miss one. Home Source, East Tennessee, does a lot of homeowner education. I also feel like Jenny Holden can the Urban League. There's tons of them. We have quite a number of HUD-approved housing counseling agencies in Knoxville that I think some additional funding is always helpful in those terms of outreach.
Yeah, it's definitely a mindset. I definitely value education. I bought my house when I was 26. So many people discouraged me from buying a home because they said I was too young. And I'm so grateful that I bought the house when I did. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Lundy. Commissioner Ward?
Thank you. Appreciate the presentation today. Just my biggest thing always is like affordability of housing, especially when, going through budget season now, talking about cop and teacher pay and employee pay here. And one of the things that stuck out to me was the joke about, you didn't get a $30,000 raise last year. And then I'm reading through this, and the median price of a new home is $417,000, and then you need to make $120,000 to be able to afford that. I don't know many people that work for county government that makes anywhere close to that. One of the big things that you also had in there was, we're short $22,000, $25,000 range, or 25,000 units, housing units for people to live in, and that we're getting close to building at the demand rate. We're just below the demand rate, and we have to build above the demand rate just to eat into that 22,000. So if we're doing somewhere around, what I think the commissioner said around, was it 2,000 right now units? What did you say earlier? For the houses, how many houses are we building right now? Permits that we're issuing? We're doing 4,000 a year, so we need to be probably closer to 5,000 or 6,000 a year just to meet and then probably dig into that 22,000 that we're short in, 25,000 that we're short in. Does that sound accurate to you?
I can follow up with a more precise. Our estimate is for the metro area,
Sure.
so it encompasses surrounding counties, but it is higher than what it's important to weight these things by households because we can say, oh, we're building this much percentage more, but it has to be. It's all relative to the size of the population. So
Sure.
we're barely kind of getting back to where we are. And to your point, some of our research that we haven't put out yet, looking at teacher salaries, for instance, the share of listings that are affordable to a starting teacher with a master's degree is, I'll tease, below 10%.
Yeah.
So it's substantial, and I would, I think it's not just a salary question. It's how do we control housing costs, and ultimately,
Housing is supply and demand, right? All economics at its core is usually supply and demand of some sort. But for us, Jesse, you wrote a great article I read this morning as well that we had over 7,000 new people come through. That's a good amount of people, and all those people need houses, and that just adds to and then because people can't afford houses now they're renting. There's not enough houses, so they're renting because you have on here only 15% of the people. 75,000 gets you 15%. That's not a lot of houses that are left for everybody left over.
Well, and I think it's important to acknowledge that it is a supply and demand thing, but unlike most markets, we don't allow, we fix supply. If Frosted Flakes get really popular, Kellogg's going to start producing a lot more Frosted Flakes. That's not really possible in the housing market, in part because we regulate land use. And we do, land use is an important thing. We have to regulate it, but it's, we also prohibit, the builders and developers' ability to respond to supply in a dynamic way. So it's not this equal market. We have to acknowledge the government side of, we are literally regulating the extent to which we can respond supply-wise. And, to some extent that is always, a necessary thing, but it's important just to, we sort of, put our hammer down on the supply-demand thing because, in many ways, regulations actually control and manipulate the supply-demand relationship.
No, I agree 100% there. I also like the point that, I used to be able to buy a new lot to build, a quarter-acre lot for 15, 20 grand when I first started building here a decade ago. And now it's easily 50, 75,000 just to get a lot, just to build a house on, which then has to go in the carry cost and the interest rates and everything else goes in. So it's, I was talking to Commissioner Oster, the $450,000 house I used to build now goes for $800,000. It's the same house. The blueprints haven't changed one bit. It's the same house I built 5 years ago. I'm building it today, but they're now worth almost double as much. And I know my wife, I said this last week, but the house I used to own, we were in it for 5 years. In 5 years, it doubled in price. The house that I've owned now for 2 years has gone up 25% in price. And I don't see anybody getting, 25% pay increases year over year to be able to afford to live at this standard. And I feel bad for the younger generation and my children that can they afford to live in Knoxville if we don't do something or build quicker? I'm not quite sure there's a singular answer to this problem, but it's gonna, how do you stop becoming Nashville? I think we're gonna be Franklin, Tennessee. We're gonna be very, very expensive to live, and we're not building at high density rates. You're just gonna have a lot of really expensive houses that people can't afford to live here. So I really appreciate the time. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Commissioner Schoonmaker?
Thank you, Madam Chair. One of our neighboring counties put a moratorium on a certain type of residential development. What kind of impact has that had on Knox County?
I have argued and I have been thankful for the support of Mayor Jacobs, and I think that Knox County has a substantial impact. Blount County, to name one, is attracting Amazon and Smith & Wesson, and then trying to reduce their residential density by 80%. They actually succeeded in that just last week, and they also temporarily stopped cluster development, which is a form of planned PUD development. So it has a substantial impact, and it's in part because it's more expensive to live in Blount County than Knox County. So all of the jobs that are being attracted to Blount County, a substantial portion of those people are commuting from Knoxville, and I think there's some good data on that from the Knox County planning, but it's also, we're not picking up on that. I mean, it's more substantial than what some of the data that Census is putting out reflects, in part just from the lag, but it's huge. We're also seeing it in Loudoun County, we're seeing it in Jefferson County. In many ways, the political boundary is fairly arbitrary, and a market doesn't really care where the political boundary is. It is one market. So it has a really substantial impact. And the extent to which we have a regional conversation, I think, is incredibly important. But we have the days of 9 counties, 1 vision. The concept of planning at a regional level is, look, we all just had a conversation about splitting up our own regional planning commission. We're moving away from that, and unfortunately, the market, we're all one market, so it has a substantial impact.
Commissioner Jay, to wrap it up.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Perfect segue. Mike Odom is here from the Chamber, and as we talk about workforce and attracted businesses, jobs, and how this has a total impact on our economic prosperity, this is your world. Can you tell us what you're seeing and how the data shared today translates into your ability to both attract, retain, or grow our workforce here?
Sure. Mike Odom, Knoxville Chamber. I usually get criticized for the negativity of my presentations, but I look like sunshine and rainbows next to Hanson, so I appreciate him doing that. Everything that you just saw is having a significant impact on our ability to draw more businesses here, to retain talent, and to draw talent. It is the #1 issue we have right now from businesses we hear that says, I want to hire people, but there's nowhere for them to live. I'm trying to attract the talent we want to, Hanson brought up the slide that talked about economic growth and prosperity. We're trying to get these people to give them better jobs so that they can have more economic growth, they can have more prosperity, and then there's nowhere there for them to live. Anecdotally, we started we're hearing from students now who are moving further and further away from campus. So we're wondering, is that impacting our traffic congestion now? And so those are the types of things. We're actually in this fiscal year business plan, we're lessening our business attraction, which is the kind of external out of town marketing, and focusing more on expansion because we just have nowhere for those folks to live if they come here. So it's a huge impact on our business and our ability to do what we do.
Thank you very much. And Hanson, will this be published in a way in which the public can consume it all if they wish?
It is up on the screen.
Okay, so it's on the website now.
You can download a PDF copy.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Yep.
I appreciate it.
Thank you, Hanson, for this presentation.
Yeah.
Appreciate what you do.
Thank you all.
All right. Our regularly scheduled commission meeting will begin at 5:05.